August 15th, 1971. A Sunday evening, millions of Americans gather around their television sets, expecting regular programming. Instead, President Richard Nixon appears with an announcement that will fundamentally change money forever. In 9 minutes, he'll tell them that the United States dollar, the world's reserve currency, will no longer be convertible to gold. The gold standard, a system that had anchored human economies for centuries, is about to die. But here's the paradox. More than 50 years later, we're still arguing about it. Central banks still hoard thousands of tons of gold in underground vaults. Politicians still invoke it during monetary debates. Investors still flee to it during crises. And every time inflation rises, someone, somewhere says, this wouldn't have happened under the gold standard. So why does a monetary system that officially ended before most of us were born still cast such a long shadow over modern economics? Why do we keep looking back at gold with a mixture of nostalgia, mistrust, and curiosity? Over the next half hour, we're going to explore not just what the gold standard was, but why it mattered, why it failed, and why, decades after its death, it refuses to stay buried. This is a story about trust, power, and the eternal question: what makes money real? Before we can understand why the gold standard still matters, we need to understand what it actually was. And fair warning, it's simpler than you think, but weirder than you'd expect. Let's start with the basics. Imagine you're living in 1900. You walk into a bank with a $20 bill. The gold standard means you can march up to the teller and demand they give you about 1 ounce of gold in exchange. Not a promise of gold, not a gold-backed security. Actual, physical gold. That's the core idea. Your paper money isn't just a piece of paper with numbers on it. It's a claim check for a specific amount of gold sitting in a vault somewhere. But here's where it gets interesting. For the gold standard to work, a country needed to follow some pretty strict rules. Rule 1. Fix the price of gold. The government would say 1 ounce of gold equals X dollars, and that rate wouldn't change. In the United States, from 1879 to 1933, 1 ounce of gold was worth $20.67. Not $20.66. Not $20.68. Exactly $20.67. Rule 2. Actually have the gold. If you're going to let people exchange paper for gold, you better have enough gold in the vault to back it up. This meant central banks and treasuries became obsessed with their gold reserves. Rule 3. Let gold move freely across borders. If someone in France wanted to send gold to someone in England, governments couldn't stop them. Gold had to flow wherever trade demanded it. Now, why gold specifically? Why not silver, or copper, or seashells? Well, gold has some unique properties. It doesn't rust or corrode. It's rare enough to be valuable, but common enough to actually use. It's divisible. You can melt it down and reshape it. And it's consistent. An ounce of gold in China is worth the same as an ounce of gold in Peru. But here's the thing historians often point out. The choice of gold was partly practical, partly cultural, and partly kind of arbitrary. Humans decided gold was special thousands of years ago, and that belief became self-fulfilling. The more people believed gold had value, the more value it actually had. So what did the gold standard actually do in practice? Think of it this way. Under the gold standard, the amount of money in an economy was directly tied to how much gold that country had. Find a new gold mine, the money supply could grow. Lose gold to another country, your money supply had to shrink. This created what economists call a self-regulating system. Let's say Britain is importing more goods from France than it's exporting. Britain would have to send gold to France to pay for those imports. As gold left Britain, Britain's money supply would shrink. With less money around, prices in Britain would fall, making British goods cheaper. Eventually, France would start buying more from Britain again, and the gold would flow back. At least, that was the theory. In reality, this automatic adjustment could be brutal. When gold left your country, it didn't just mean falling prices. It could mean unemployment, business failures, and economic pain. But we'll get to that. For now, understand this. The gold standard wasn't just an economic policy. It was a philosophy about what money should be. It said that money should be anchored to something real, something you could touch, something that couldn't be created out of thin air by governments or banks. And for a while, much of the world agreed. Britain didn't set out to create a global monetary system. They kind of stumbled into it. In 1717, yes, more than 3 centuries ago, Isaac Newton, who was master of the Royal Mint at the time, set a price for gold that accidentally made it more profitable to use gold coins than silver ones. Over time, Britain drifted onto what historians call the de facto gold standard. But the real adoption happened in 1821, after the Napoleonic Wars. Britain officially declared that the pound sterling would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate. And here's why that mattered. Britain was the economic superpower of the 19th century. At its peak, the British Empire controlled about a quarter of the world's land and population. British merchants traded everywhere. British banks financed everything. If you wanted to do international business in the 1800s, you probably dealt with British pounds, and British pounds were backed by gold. This created a powerful incentive for other countries to adopt the gold standard too. If Britain was on gold, and you wanted to trade with Britain, which almost everyone did, being on gold made everything simpler. Germany joined in 1871 after unification. The United States officially adopted the gold standard in 1879. France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Italy followed. By 1900, almost every major economy in the world was on the gold standard. But this wasn't just about trade convenience. The gold standard became a symbol of credibility. Think about it from a government's perspective. If you were a small country trying to attract foreign investment, what better way to signal that you were stable and trustworthy than to tie your currency to gold? It was like saying, we can't mess around with the money supply. We're playing by the same rules as everyone else. And for a while, it seemed to work beautifully. Between roughly 1870 and 1914, a period sometimes called the Classical Gold Standard era, the world experienced something remarkable. International trade exploded, capital flowed freely across borders, exchange rates were stable and predictable. If you were a merchant in New York doing business with someone in Hamburg, you didn't have to worry about currency fluctuations. A dollar was worth a certain amount of gold. A mark was worth a certain amount of gold. The math was simple. Economists point to this era as evidence that the gold standard promoted stability and prosperity. And they're not entirely wrong. There were real benefits. Benefit 1, predictability. Exchange rates between gold standard countries stayed fixed, making international trade less risky. Benefit 2, discipline. Governments couldn't just print money whenever they wanted. The gold supply limited inflation. Benefit 3, confidence. People trusted that their money would hold value because it was backed by something tangible. But here's what often gets left out of the nostalgic stories about this golden age. It was a golden age for some people, not everyone. The classical gold standard era coincided with the height of European imperialism. Those stable trade networks, they often relied on colonies that had no choice in the matter. The capital flowing freely, it tended to flow from rich countries to rich countries, not to where it was needed most. And even in the wealthy nations, the benefits weren't evenly distributed. Remember that automatic adjustment mechanism we talked about? When a country lost gold and prices had to fall, that meant deflation. And deflation meant lower wages, fewer jobs, and economic pain for workers and farmers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1914, the gold standard still looked like the natural order of things. It had been in place for so long that many economists assumed it would last forever. Then came August 1914, and everything changed. World War I didn't just kill millions of people, it killed the classical gold standard. When the war started, governments faced a problem. Modern warfare was insanely expensive. Artillery shells, machine guns, tanks, airplanes, all of it required money on a scale never seen before. But under the gold standard, the governments couldn't just print money to pay for the war. They were constrained by their gold reserves. So what did they do? They suspended the gold standard. One by one, European powers announced that paper money would no longer be convertible to gold. Britain suspended in 1914. France and Germany followed. It was supposed to be temporary, just for the duration of the war. But here's what happened. Once the shackles of gold were off, governments printed money to finance the war effort. And when the war ended in 1918, many countries found themselves with massive debts, depleted gold reserves, and currencies that had lost significant value. Germany was hit especially hard. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflation of the early 1920s became legendary. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Prices could double in a single day. Life savings became worthless. Now, to be clear, this wasn't caused by the gold standard. It was caused by the war and the massive reparations Germany was forced to pay. But it reinforced a belief that paper money without gold backing was dangerous. So, throughout the 1920s, there was enormous pressure to return to gold, to restore the old order, to make things normal again. Britain led the charge. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made the fateful decision to return the pound to gold at its pre-war exchange rate. It was a disaster. The problem was that the pre-war exchange rate overvalued the pound. British exports became too expensive. Industries struggled to compete. Unemployment soared. Churchill himself later called it the worst mistake of his life. But Britain wasn't alone. Country after country tried to restore the gold standard in the 1920s, and country after country struggled with the same issue. The world had changed, but they were trying to use the old rules. Then came October 1929. The Wall Street crash didn't immediately break the gold standard, but it set in motion a series of events that would. As the American economy collapsed, American banks started failing. Nervous depositors rushed to withdraw their money and convert it to gold. This drained gold from American banks. Meanwhile, Europe was already struggling. American banks had been lending heavily to European countries during the 1920s. When the crash happened, those loans dried up. European economies, still recovering from the war, started to wobble. And here's where the gold standard made everything worse. Under the gold standard rules, when gold left your country, you were supposed to contract your money supply, raise interest rates, let prices fall. But in the middle of the worst economic crisis in modern history, that was exactly the wrong thing to do. What the economy needed, more money in circulation, lower interest rates, government spending to create jobs. What the gold standard required, less money in circulation, higher interest rates, balanced budgets. It was like trying to cure a patient dying of dehydration by draining more blood. Between 1929 and 1933, the global economy contracted by roughly 15%. Unemployment in the United States hit 25%. Industrial production fell by half. International trade collapsed by 65%. And throughout this catastrophe, economists and policymakers were divided. Some argued that the gold standard was causing the crisis, or at least making it worse. Others insisted that abandoning gold would destroy trust in money itself. Here's a question worth sitting with. Could the Great Depression have been prevented, or at least softened, if countries had abandoned the gold standard earlier? Modern economic research suggests the answer is yes. Studies have found that countries that left the gold standard earlier recovered faster. Those that clung to it longest suffered the most. Britain abandoned gold in 1931 and began recovering. The United States held on until 1933. France didn't leave until 1936 and had one of the slowest recoveries. The gold standard had promised stability and discipline. But when the world needed flexibility and intervention, it delivered rigidity and pain. By the mid-1930s, the classical gold standard was dead. But the story of gold and money wasn't over, not by a long shot. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. When Franklin Roosevelt spoke those words in 1933, American banks were collapsing at a rate of dozens per day. People were hoarding gold, terrified that their dollars would become worthless. Roosevelt's response was radical. He declared a bank holiday, shutting down every bank in America. Then, he did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for Americans to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates. With few exceptions, everyone had to turn in their gold to the government in exchange for paper dollars. Think about that for a moment. The government essentially confiscated a large portion of private gold holdings, and most Americans complied. Then Roosevelt revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce, a devaluation of the dollar by about 40%. This was meant to stimulate the economy by making American exports cheaper and raising domestic prices. Did it work? Economists still debate that. But one thing was clear. The old gold standard, where ordinary citizens could freely convert dollars to gold, was finished in America. By the late 1930s, the world's monetary system was fragmented. Some countries still officially used gold, others had abandoned it. International trade was hamstrung by currency controls and competitive devaluations. Then came World War II. And just like World War I, the war completely disrupted monetary systems. Governments printed money to finance the war effort. Gold flows were controlled and manipulated. By 1945, the world needed a new monetary order. In July 1944, even before the war had ended, delegates from 44 countries gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for a conference that would reshape global finance. The challenge was enormous. How do you create a stable international monetary system without returning to the rigid gold standard that had failed so spectacularly? The solution, crafted largely by American economist Harry Dexter White and British economist John Maynard Keynes, was ingenious and weird in equal measure. It was called the Bretton Woods system, and here's how it worked. Layer 1. The US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, but only for foreign central banks, not for ordinary people. Layer 2. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. Layer 3. Countries would maintain these fixed rates, but with some flexibility to adjust if their economy really needed it. In other words, it was a gold standard, but only kind of. The dollar was backed by gold. Everything else was backed by the dollar. It was like a pyramid with gold at the top, the dollar in the middle, and every other currency at the bottom. This system had a crucial assumption built into it, that the United States would have enough gold to back all the dollars in circulation. And in 1945, that seemed reasonable. America held about 60% of the world's monetary gold reserves. For about 25 years, Bretton Woods worked remarkably well. The world economy boomed, international trade expanded, Western Europe and Japan rebuilt. It was, by many measures, a golden age of capitalism, but there was a problem building in the background, slowly, inevitably, like water seeping through a dam. The United States was spending dollars faster than it was accumulating gold. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the space race, social programs, all of it required money. Meanwhile, American companies were investing heavily abroad, and that meant dollars flowing out of the country. By the 1960s, foreign central banks held more dollars than the U.S. had gold to back them with. If every foreign central bank had tried to convert their dollars to gold at the same time, the U.S. couldn't have paid. This was called the Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who predicted it. For the dollar to be the world's reserve currency, the U.S. had to run deficits and send dollars abroad. But the more dollars that went abroad, the less credible the gold backing became. It was a trap with no good escape. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, was the first to call the bluff. Starting in 1965, France began converting its dollar reserves to gold and shipping the gold home. De Gaulle called the Bretton Woods system an exorbitant privilege for America, the ability to print the world's money and buy whatever it wanted. He wasn't entirely wrong. Other countries started getting nervous. By 1971, the U.S. gold reserves had fallen from over 20,000 tons to less than 9,000 tons. The system was breaking. Which brings us back to August 15th, 1971. Richard Nixon went on television that Sunday evening and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. He called it a temporary measure. It's been temporary for more than 50 years. The Nixon shock, as it became known, effectively ended the last link between gold and the world's monetary system. Within a few years, all major currencies were floating freely against each other, with no gold backing at all. And yet, when Nixon made that announcement, he didn't say, "Gold is irrelevant now," or "we're moving beyond gold." Even as he severed the connection, he couldn't quite let go of the symbolism. The gold standard was dead, but its ghost was just beginning to haunt us. Here's a weird fact. The United States government still owns about 8,000 tons of gold. That's roughly 147 million ounces, worth over $300 billion at current prices. The dollar hasn't been convertible to gold for more than 50 years. So why does the government still keep all this gold sitting in vaults doing absolutely nothing? And it's not just America. Germany holds 3,300 tons. Italy, 2,400 tons. France, 2,400 tons. Central banks around the world collectively own more than 35,000 tons of gold. If gold is irrelevant to modern money, why hasn't anyone sold it? The answer tells us something important about why the gold standard still haunts modern economics. It's not just history, it's psychology. Let's talk about trust. Modern money, what economists call fiat currency, has value because governments say it does and because people believe they can use it to buy things. There's no gold backing it, no silver, no physical commodity at all. It's trust formalized. And for the most part, this works brilliantly. The dollar, the euro, the yen, they're all fiat currencies and they function perfectly well for billions of daily transactions. But here's the thing about trust. It's invisible when you have it and catastrophic when you lose it. When people lose faith in a currency, things can spiral very quickly. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela in the 2010s. These weren't ancient history. They happened in our lifetimes. And in every case, people abandoned the local currency and fled to something more stable. Often, that something was US dollars. Sometimes it was gold. And that's where the haunting begins. Every time there's a financial crisis, gold prices spike. Every time inflation rises, people start talking about gold again. Every time trust in government or central banks wavers, the ghost of the gold standard reappears. Let me show you the pattern. 2008, financial crisis. Gold prices nearly triple from 2008 to 2011 as people lose faith in banks and governments. COVID-19. Pandemic. Gold hits all-time highs in 2020 as governments print unprecedented amounts of money. 2022, inflation surge. Gold becomes a hot topic again as inflation reaches levels not seen in 40 years. Notice something? Gold's modern relevance has almost nothing to do with the gold standard as it actually existed. It has everything to do with what the gold standard represents in our collective memory. In the popular imagination, the gold standard era represents stability, sound money, and limited government. It represents a time when money meant something, when you couldn't just print wealth out of thin air. Now, is that historically accurate? Well, we've already seen that it's not. The gold standard era had plenty of financial panics, depressions, and instability, but memory is selective. We remember the perceived benefits and forget the very real costs. This nostalgia has created what some economists call gold bugs, people who believe we should return to a gold standard. They're not conspiracy theorists or economic cranks. Many are serious investors, economists, and policymakers who genuinely believe that tying money to gold would solve modern monetary problems. Their argument goes something like this. Point 1. Fiat currency allows governments to inflate the money supply at will, which devalues savings and wages. Point 2. The gold standard would impose discipline on governments and central banks, preventing excessive spending and money printing. Point 3, gold has maintained value for thousands of years. Paper currencies come and go, but gold is eternal. Now, before we dismiss this, we should acknowledge they're not completely wrong. Governments can and sometimes do abuse their power to print money. Inflation can destroy wealth, and gold has indeed held value across centuries and cultures. But here's where the argument gets complicated. Modern economists point out several major problems with returning to a gold standard. Problem 1, the gold supply is essentially random. Gold production depends on mining, which depends on geology and technology, not on what the economy needs. Why should the money supply be determined by how much shiny metal we dig out of the ground? Problem 2, the gold standard takes away the tools that central banks use to fight recessions. When the economy slows down, central banks can cut interest rates and increase money supply to stimulate growth. Under a gold standard, they couldn't do that. Problem 3, we've tried this before and it didn't end well. The historical record is pretty clear. Gold standard economies were more volatile, not less. But here's what's fascinating. Even though almost no mainstream economists support returning to a full gold standard, the debate refuses to die. Why? Because it's not really about economics anymore. It's about values. The gold standard debate is really a debate about how much we trust institutions. How much power should central banks have? Should money be anchored to something physical, or can it be purely abstract? Is inflation always bad, or is some inflation acceptable if it helps employment? These are philosophical questions, as much as economic ones. And this is why central banks still keep gold, even though they don't use it to back their currencies. It's a strategic reserve, yes, but it's also psychological insurance. It's a way of saying, we have something real, something tangible, just in case. Just in case of what? That's the question nobody wants to fully answer. The ghost of the gold standard haunts us because it represents a fundamental anxiety about modern money. If money is just paper, or increasingly just numbers in a computer, what stops it from becoming worthless? The honest answer? Nothing but trust. Trust in institutions, trust in government, trust in each other. And maybe that's what makes us uncomfortable. Maybe that's why we keep looking back at gold with longing, because gold felt permanent, eternal, real, even if that feeling was always, to some extent, an illusion. So if the gold standard is dead, what replaced it? And how does modern money actually work? Let's start with what money is supposed to do. Economists will tell you money serves 3 basic functions. 1, medium of exchange. You can use it to buy stuff. 2, unit of account. You can measure value with it. 3, store of value. You can save it for later and expect it to still have worth. Now, here's the thing. The gold standard and fiat currency approach these functions very differently. Gold standard, medium of exchange, works but limited by gold supply unit of account. Very stable over long periods. Store of value, excellent, gold holds value for centuries. Fiat currency, medium of exchange, works excellently. Flexible supply unit of account, stable in short to medium term. Store of value, loses value over time due to inflation. See the trade-off? The gold standard was amazing at preserving value over long periods. Put gold coins in a vault in 1900, dig them up in 2000, and they'd still be worth something. Try that with a pile of paper money, and inflation would have destroyed most of its value. But that stability came at a huge cost. The economy couldn't adjust when it needed to. Modern fiat currency is the opposite bargain. It gives central banks and governments the flexibility to respond to economic crises. But it requires constant management, and yes, it allows for inflation. Here's how it works today. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the US or the European Central Bank, control the money supply. But they don't do it arbitrarily. They have mandates, usually something like maintain price stability and maximize employment. They use tools like interest rates and bond purchases to expand or contract the money supply based on economic conditions. Economy overheating with too much inflation? Raise interest rates and reduce money supply? Economy in recession? Lower rates and increase money supply? It's active management versus the gold standard's automatic passive system. Now, which is better? The data is pretty clear. Since moving off the gold standard, advanced economies have experienced longer economic expansions, shorter, less severe recessions, more stable employment, higher average growth rates. But they've also experienced persistent inflation, larger government debts, greater income inequality, though that's debated, more complex financial systems. The world economy is much larger now than it was in the gold standard era, but it's also more interconnected, more complex, and arguably more fragile in different ways. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Money is becoming increasingly digital. You probably use cash less than your parents did. Your kids might never use it at all. Most money today exists purely as digital entries in banking systems. You tap your phone and numbers move from one account to another. No gold, no paper, just data. This has led some people to ask, if money can be completely digital, do we even need central banks? Could we have cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin replace government money? Bitcoin in particular is fascinating because its creators designed it as a kind of digital gold standard. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. No central authority can create more. It's scarce by design, just like gold. And Bitcoin advocates make similar arguments to gold standard advocates. Government money can be inflated away, but Bitcoin can't be. It's a hedge against institutional failure. But Bitcoin has also proven to be wildly volatile. In 2021, it hit nearly $70,000. By 2022, it had fallen below $20,000. That kind of volatility makes it terrible as a medium of exchange or unit of account. You can't run an economy when the money supply swings 50% in a few months. What Bitcoin and gold share is this. They're assets people flee to when they don't trust traditional institutions. They're hedges against the system, not parts of it, and that's telling. Modern money works because most people, most of the time, trust it. The dollar holds value because you believe you can spend it tomorrow. That belief is reinforced by millions of daily transactions, by legal frameworks, by the backing of the world's largest economy. But that trust isn't automatic. It has to be earned and maintained, and that's the real job of central banks today. Not to back money with gold, but to back it with credibility, to make the right decisions, often enough that people believe the system works. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than the gold standard? By most measures, yes. Does everyone trust it? Absolutely not. And that's why the gold standard's ghost keeps showing up. Because trust is fragile, and when it breaks, we look for something solid to hold on to, even if that something is a memory of a system that was never as solid as we thought it was. So, after 25 minutes of history, economics, and ghosts, where does that leave us? Was the gold standard misunderstood, misused, or simply obsolete? The truth is probably all three. The gold standard was misunderstood. People remember it as an era of perfect stability, when in fact it was marked by regular financial panics, brutal deflations, and rigid constraints that often made economic problems worse. It was misused. Countries tried to restore it after World War I at unrealistic exchange rates. They clung to it during the Great Depression when flexibility was desperately needed. They treated gold's value as natural law rather than social convention. And yes, it became obsolete. The modern global economy, with its complexity, size, and interconnection, simply can't function under the constraints of a commodity-based money system. The gold supply can't grow fast enough to match economic growth without causing deflation. But here's what the gold standard got right and why its memory persists. It understood that money requires trust. That trust isn't automatic, that people need to believe their money will hold value. The gold standard provided that trust through physical backing. Modern fiat currency has to provide it through institutional credibility and good policy. And that's harder. It requires constant vigilance, expertise, and wisdom from central banks. It requires political systems that let those banks operate independently. It requires, fundamentally, that we trust each other and our institutions. When that trust breaks down, through war, crisis, or bad policy, people remember gold. They remember a time when money seemed simpler, more real, more solid. But nostalgia can be dangerous. Every monetary system is a human creation. Every system has trade-offs. The gold standard prioritized long-term stability over short-term flexibility. Modern fiat currency does the opposite. Neither is perfect. Both can fail. What's interesting is what we've learned. Modern economists understand things that gold standard advocates in 1900 didn't. We know that some inflation is acceptable, even beneficial, if it helps maintain employment. We know that rigid systems can make crises worse. We know that automatic mechanisms aren't always superior to thoughtful human judgment. But we've also learned the lessons of hyperinflation, of institutional failure, of what happens when central banks lose credibility. The best monetary systems going forward probably won't be pure gold standards or completely unconstrained fiat currency. There'll be something more sophisticated, systems that provide flexibility when needed, but also maintain credibility and trust. Maybe that's central bank digital currencies with transparent rules. Maybe it's better institutional frameworks. Maybe it's something we haven't invented yet. But here's what we can say with confidence. The gold standard isn't coming back, not in its classical form. The world has moved on. And yet, gold itself isn't going anywhere either. Those thousands of tons in central bank vaults, they'll stay there quietly, just in case. Because we haven't fully figured out how to replace what gold represented, permanence in an impermanent world. So why does the gold standard still haunt modern economies? Because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What makes money real? What happens when trust fails? How do we balance stability with flexibility? How much should we trust institutions versus rules? These aren't questions with easy answers. They're tensions we navigate, debates we have, choices we make. The gold standard is dead, but the questions it raised are very much alive. And maybe that's its real legacy. Not the system itself, but the reminder that money is about more than economics. It's about trust, values, and what kind of society we want to build. What do you think? Should we return to a gold standard, or is fiat currency working? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this video made you think, do me a favor, hit the like button, and subscribe to Histonom because I dive deep into topics like this on this channel.